Good morning from the Philippines, good afternoon, and good evening to friends and guests who are joining us from other parts of the globe. My name is Daniel Ratilla, the Program Officer for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and I will be serving as your host for today's session. I am pleased to welcome you all to the inaugural session of our second webinar series, Climate Research as if People Mattered. The name draws inspiration from the article Small is Beautiful, Climate Change Science as if People Mattered, which is written by Dr. Regina Rodriguez and Dr. Theodore Shepard, co-chairs of the Science Plan Development Team of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. It reflects on insights from E.F. Schumacher's celebrated book, Small is Beautiful, that may be applied in closing the gap between how climate information is being produced and used. We just recently ended our first webinar series a couple of weeks back, so if you joined us then, welcome back, and it's great to see some familiar faces and names. Today's session is titled Storying Climate, Transdisciplinary Adventures in the Classroom and Beyond. This webinar series is organized by the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, which is hosted by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. My Climate Risk, or MCR, is a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, which aims to develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to regional climate risk. In our previous series, we strove to have a better understanding of local contexts and experiences of climate change and the requirements of decision makers. In this webinar series, we will explore how the different contexts and experiences of climate change are considered and how we may apply these in research design and management plans. Today's session in particular will focus on stories as pedagogy and as an instrument of hope. Just some reminders before we start. Please note that the program is being recorded on Zoom. Second, on Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. Throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions that you may have in the chat box here on Zoom. Participants via Facebook Live may also type in their comments or questions in the comment section. We will collect these for the open forum later on. And finally, there will be an evaluation survey at the end of the session. Requests for e-certificates may be made through the same form. At this point, we would like to ask everyone to settle in for the prayer to be followed by the Philippine National Anthem. An interfaith prayer for our climate. We hold the earth. We hold siblings who suffer from storms and droughts intensified by change. We hold all species that suffer. We hold world leaders delegated to make decisions for life. We pray that the web of life may be mended through courageous actions to limit carbon emissions. We pray for right actions for adaptation and mitigation to help our already suffering Earth community. We pray that love and wisdom might inspire my actions and our actions as communities, so that we may, with integrity, look into the eyes of our siblings and all beings and truthfully say, we are doing our part to care for them and the future of the children. May love transform us and our world with new steps toward life.
Magiliw, kailas ang sinanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhati pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang ligaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
And now, to formally welcome everyone to today's session, we would like to call on Dr. Charlotte Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez, the Director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and focal point of the MCR Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, to deliver the opening remarks.
Good morning, colleagues and friends, and welcome to this inaugural session of the webinar series entitled Climate Research as if People Mattered. As Daniel had explained in his introduction, when it comes to climate information, there is a gap between what is produced and what is used. And the My Climate Risk Hubs are exploring tools and approaches that could help bridge that gap. In our other webinar series on climate voices, we sought to better understand local contexts and hence the adaptation needs of diverse stakeholders on the ground. Community-based organizations, coastal communities, and micro-enterprises to start with. In this webinar series on climate research, we explore innovative approaches for practicing climate change science, communication, and risk management from an inter- and transdisciplinary perspective, highlighting research as a means of caring for communities and building relationships as well as resilience. Or we might even say, building resilience in the process of building those relationships. In this inaugural webinar, we invite Dr. Vandana Singh, Professor of Physics and Environment at the Department of Environment, Society, and Sustainability of Framingham State University. Although her PhD is in particle physics, she has been working on the Transdisciplinary Scholarship of Climate Change, focusing on innovative pedagogies, and has published critically acclaimed science fiction. It is no surprise, therefore, that today she will be telling us stories. She affirms that stories from science play a huge role in our understanding of the phenomena around us and can be powerful pedagogical tools. So given our own context at the Ateneo, as a higher education institution, it is but fitting that we kick off this webinar series with an examination of our own practices in climate education and how we can better make this part of mitigation and adaptation strategies. A bottom-up approach to climate science includes empowering people to make sense of their own situation, in the words of Ted Shepard and Regina Rodriguez, and to connect their local context to global phenomena. Education will undoubtedly play a critical role here, so it is crucial that we reflect on how learning becomes doing and how we can better foster dialogue across sociocultural groups, serve the marginalized, and galvanize inclusive and just climate action. It is my pleasure, therefore, to welcome you to this event, and I congratulate Dr. Singh in advance for what I know will be a thought-provoking discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it's such a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be among you all. My thanks to the Ateneo de Manila University, the Hub, the Institute of Sustainability, the Hub for the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity, and especially to Dr. Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez, for inviting me, and to Jean Hardeleza Mijares and Daniel Rotilia for making it all so easy. So I want to begin, before I share my screen, I want to begin by acknowledging the land from which I'm talking to you. The land where I live and work, Framingham, Massachusetts, is the original homeland of the Nipmuc people. And I want to acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forcible removal from this territory. And I honor and respect the many and diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land. So I'm going to share my screen, and just give me a second. All right, here we go. Okay, I hope everyone can see. And I'm going to put it on full screen. Okay, so I'm going to try to live up to the title of this talk by starting with two little stories. So here's my first story. This is a story from the Alaskan Arctic. And it is a creation I made for my classroom based on interviews with scientists and with the native peoples of the North Slope of Alaska. And this is how it goes. Some 30 years ago, a scientist and his team walked across the sea ice from the shore of the Arctic Ocean, north of Utqiagvik in Alaska. Their aim was to study the sea ice. So they were walking to the liquid water boundary. And as perhaps not everyone may know, I should explain that sea ice is the top surface, the frozen surface of seawater. And it can be anywhere between a few centimeters to a few meters thick. So the scientists were walking across the sea ice on a perfect day. There was barely a breath of air stirring. There were no warnings from the meteorological stations. However, as they approached the liquid water boundary, the native elder who was their guide suddenly said, "We've got to turn back. We got to get off the ice right now." The scientists didn't believe him. There was no reason to. But there was something about the urgency of his tone that compelled them to obey. So reluctantly, they set off back towards the shore. And as they walked towards the shore, there was a deafening crack, and a large section of sea ice, in fact, the very section they had intended to camp on, broke off from the shore-fast ice and floated off into the Arctic Ocean. Now, in those days particularly, 30 years ago, there was no Coast Guard presence, so that if you were marooned on a piece of floating sea ice, it was a death sentence. The elder had saved the lives of the scientists. The second story I'm going to tell you is closer to the location of my kind hosts in the Philippines. In fact, it's from the country I come from, India. And this story is called The Village Women and the Forest. And the way I know this story is through a conversation I had with the woman in the red and white sari, whose name is Parvati. I had that conversation in 2019 when a friend of mine who works with that community happened to be visiting, and so she had access to a phone. And this is what she told me. She said that 25 years ago, that region of Jharkhand, which is a state in India, was heavily forested with thick contiguous forests. And there were bears and tigers and many, many different species, and village communities that depended on the forests for their well-being, and also on agriculture, so basically for survival. And what had happened was that 25 years ago, those forests were starting to be cut down. Deforestation was happening for building roads, for mining, for quarrying. And the villagers noticed a few changes. Firstly, the water table dropped. Agricultural productivity went down. The streams in the remaining forest started drying up. Animals disappeared. And there were outbreaks of malaria, and summer temperatures became intolerable. So about 22 years ago or so, Parvati decided to do something about it. So she and the other village women got together and started to patrol the forest every morning, often engaging in the dangerous work of repelling would-be loggers. Not only that, they made mud and stone check dams to keep the water in the forest, and they dug ponds for the animals. And so my friend who was visiting them reported that the tree trunks had thickened. You could hear streams in the forests again. And what Parvati told me was that animals had come back, except for the tiger. And the water table was up, agriculture became productive again. The malarial menace had declined. And she told me, and she's a very articulate, passionate person. She told me that now she was so lucky because the water village pump was working again, and she only had to walk 1 kilometer every day for her daily water needs. So these are two stories with which I begin talking about climate change in my general physics classes. And I didn't always do this. In fact, when I first learned about climate change and got sufficiently worried about it to work through some textbooks and teach myself this stuff, because studying quarks doesn't give you enough information about what's happening to the world climate. So when I did all that, I decided that I had an ethical imperative that if young people were going to be disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, then it was my ethical duty to arm them with the knowledge that would help them face a dire future, and also to that perhaps they might even become change makers. So, however, my early attempt, and so this is my story braiding in with the other stories I've told you, my early attempt was a failure. I began by seeing where climate science, basic climate science topics intersected with a general physics course. So, for example, the greenhouse effect, why carbon dioxide is a warming gas, the evidence, the impacts, all of that. The reason I say that this was a failure, my early attempts were failures, is because of student reactions. So my naive assumptions that I was actually arming them for the future were dashed when I saw reactions like these, that this is depressing, what can we do? We are helpless. If it's not affecting me, so I don't care. Oh, I'm just one person. What can I do about it? There's no hope until we go to another planet. Technology will save us. It's because of the ozone layer, and so on. You'll notice about some of these comments that I collected in the early years that they're both emotional and cognitive. So emotional reactions, and typically the kinds of emotional reactions that paralyze action because it's apathy, despair, hopelessness, grief. And also there's cognitive confusion. So the kinds of misconceptions that are in the public sphere about climate change were not dissipated due to my attempts to teach the basics. So I had to go back to the drawing board and I had to become a student again. But what I didn't know at that time was that my experience was not atypical. So we know now from research that knowledge of the basic science is insufficient. The link between information and behavior, that knowing the basic science is necessary, but not sufficient. Political orientation, the politics of affinity groups, all of that moderates the relationship between climate change and concern about the problem. We also know that science literacy and quantitative literacy, people with the highest degrees in that realm, were not the most concerned about climate change. In fact, that group was the most polarized on this question. And also among those people who were interested in climate change and worried about it, they didn't talk about it, let alone do something about it. Now, note that all this research and much of what I quote is research from the global north. And I want to point out that there's not enough research. There's a huge gap between education research in the global north and education research in the global south. And we all know that the global south is going to be extremely heavily impacted, and in fact already is. So it's not just that the knowledge of the basic science is not enough. There's a recent report just this year that everybody should pay attention to, where the scholar Christina Kwok looked at the country's nationally determined contributions with regard to climate negotiations. And there are 4 findings. One is that countries are not paying enough attention to climate change education. In an ideal world, climate change education would be a great ally of climate mitigation. That's how it should be, and yet that's not the case. The second finding is that countries are not considering strengthening education systems. So you might think that the very basic, low-hanging fruit of knowing that we are going to have energy transformation, so we need people trained to manage those systems, even that is not getting sufficient attention. Another finding is that countries continue to ignore the contributions that an investment in girls' education can make towards climate strategy. We know from a wide variety of research that girls' education is one of those things that has ripple effects in multiple directions, and yet that is being ignored. And the fourth finding is that the countries most responsible for the climate problem are not talking about climate change education, and that's North America and Western Europe. So it's not just that climate change education is being ignored, but climate change education as it exists today is failing us. And another report that's about 2 years old asks this question: is the education sector standing up to the task of climate action? The short answer is no. And of the 5 macro level roadblocks, one of the ones identified is the lack of radical visions for climate education. So the lack of radical visions for climate education is part of the focus of what I'd like to talk to you about. So I, went on a journey of learning where I had to learn from the climate itself through climate scientists, but also through communities that were suffering some of the worst impacts. And so that's what led me to Northern Alaska, the North Slope of Alaska in 2014, the town of Utqiagvik, population 4,000, mostly native Inupiat. And here I am standing on the beach with the sea ice glittering in the background. It's here that I collected the material that resulted in the story, The Scientist and the Elder. Now, the stories by themselves are seeds, are pedagogical seeds. It's when you set them in context that the different threads start to emerge. So the Alaskan Arctic context, we know that the Arctic is warming, as a whole has warmed 4 times faster, according to a 2022 research. We know the sea ice extent and mass are going down. But the context is not just physical or even biophysical. It's also to do with the communities that live there, human and non-human. And in exploring the context, we must pay attention to the history of settler colonialism, the struggle for land rights, the relationship that the native peoples have with the oil industry and all of that. So similarly, my second story, The Village Women and the Forest, set in India. Here is the little state of Jharkhand. And the population there is 25% tribal peoples and 12% scheduled castes, that is the bottommost layer in the caste hierarchy. And the climate projections for the state are dire. Increased rainfall variability, temperatures increased in both winter and summer, already heat waves. In 2010, they had 100 heat waves. Decrease in agricultural productivity, more human-animal conflict. In fact, Jharkhand is the most climate vulnerable state in a country that is very climate vulnerable. And one of the causes is, apart from poverty, is also lack of forest cover, because the communities there rely on healthy forests for their well-being. So it's from the context that these stories acquire meaning. So I have been collecting these stories for the last several years from different parts of the world. And there are about 5 or 6 typically that I tell in a classroom, and sometimes more. And so if we think of the climate as teacher, some of the lessons I learned, and these will be obvious to some of you who are experts, but believe me, these are not there in education. So it's worth spelling them out. So one thing, of course, is that climate breakdown spans enormous scales of space and time. So from the slow rise in temperature over the last 150 years since the start of the Industrial Revolution to the 5 days of extreme rainfall and the 60 days of extreme rainfall that caused floods in Pakistan, where 1,500 people died, 33 million were displaced, and millions of acres of crops are still underwater. So the time scales are vast, but also climate manifests locally all around the world. Now, in the mainstream elite discourse about climate change, it tends to accentuate the global, and it tends to be top-down and bureaucratic. But climate reality manifests on the ground in local places where people live, and climate action also happens locally. So part of the project of climate justice is to foreground the local and to make clear the connections between the local and the global. So the other thing that I think is obvious from these two stories is their inherent transdisciplinarity. That firstly, in two senses. One is that you can see the threads of multiple disciplines, not just climate science, physics, chemistry, biology, but also sociology, history, environment, and so on. Economics, of course, as well. The other way that this is a transdisciplinary matter is that the climate crisis is tied in with other problems, with inequality, with species extinction, to name a few, and it's part of a polycrisis. Then again, the climate system is a complex system. It is rife with innate relationality. It's full of relationships across space and time, across human and non-human systems. And understanding it in a holistic, systemic way is very important. And then, of course, it's clear that neither the tribal peoples of the North Slope of Alaska nor the Jharkhand villagers have created the problem of climate change. And yet, they are the ones suffering the greatest impacts. And so central to the climate problem are considerations of justice and power. So any educational approach must embrace the key features of the problem we are trying to teach and engage with. And yet, can conventional ways of thinking and teaching handle the breakdown of our climatic systems? Well, I'm going to make a generalization here, so forgive me for that. I'm going to make the generalization that in modern industrial civilization, the way we are taught to think is firstly to think short-term and local, consider annual stockholder reports, consider election cycles. And we have a limited empathic reach. Our education system is compartmentalized. So biologists don't talk to poets, physicists don't talk to economists. We are not taught to recognize and work with complex systems. Students ask me when I teach about complex systems in college, why were we never taught about this before? When they recognize that the world is full of complex systems. And also we live in highly unequal power hierarchies that make us blind to power structures that get in the way of action and in fact often co-opt the discourse as well. So comparing that with what I consider the key teachings or features of the climate crisis, we can see that there's a fatal mismatch. And so no wonder there's a problem. So back to the classroom and to my two stories. So when I tell these stories, I ask the students what questions arise in their minds. And so here is one question that comes up. What is this thing called sea ice? Why were the scientists studying it? And that leads us into an exploration of sea ice structure, formation, the physics of it, the seasonal changes, and what's happening to it from a climate sense, and the consequences, local and planetary. And then always there's this question, how did the elder know that the sea ice was going to break off? And that leads us into looking at indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous relationships to the land and the ecosystem, how that's changed over time, the history of the struggle for land rights, and the impact of sea ice retreat on Inupiaq lives, culture, identity. So, and then we use a systems thinking tool called concept mapping to make these connections clear. So students draw these, I give them a skeleton and then they put it all together. And we see that you can see how we can go here from we can map out the relationships and we can go from the local, from a regional local phenomenon to the planet as a whole and back again. Similarly, I raise questions when I tell the story about the village women in the forest. I invite questions. And the first question always is, what has this story got to do with climate change? Because I don't even mention climate change when I tell this story. So of course, there are two things that happen. Well, one is that climate vulnerability of Jharkhand arises when you introduce the context. And against that context, the story of these women stands out as both brave and poignant. But then also, we can point out that it's not just climate change. In fact, climate change is not the immediate threat in this story. The immediate threat is deforestation for mining and roads and quarrying. And so, in other words, there is a lot that's going on here, much more than climate. And the idea of a polycrisis, species extinction due to forest loss, the setting aside of and the pushing away of and the dispossession of the people who live in those regions. All of that, inequality, injustice, all of that comes in. And then, of course, there's another question that how did women who have no education, never read a book on ecology, how did they know to regenerate a forest? And there again is an opportunity to introduce the importance of local and indigenous knowledge systems and similar examples of women's agency from around the world, because Parvati's story in India is not unique. Within India, there are hundreds of stories, and around the world, there are many stories. Like, for instance, Nemonte Nenkimo in South America, Wangari Maathai in Africa. So, and also this story gives us a chance to explore a little bit about tropical forest ecosystems, their role in microclimate and climate. And of course, for many students, it's the first time that they become aware of the conflict between the comfort in their relatively privileged lives and the price that other people and other species and other places pay for that. So then we get to open the question as to, well, let's look at 20th century economic models. Development for whom? At what cost? What do we mean by development? And colonial history, justice, power issues, all of that comes in. So again, we can map all of these out, and I'll just go very quickly through this because I don't want to take more time than I should. But this systems thinking tool of concept mapping, which is something that students learn from day one, is very useful in seeing the connections between the local and the global. So moving on then, what I have done over the last few years is to try to answer the question, and this is always something that is a project that is ongoing, okay? One never stops learning. And from my perspective, there seem to be four essential dimensions of an effective pedagogy of climate change. So the scientific technological needs no explanation, but there's also the transdisciplinary dimension that I've drawn out a few threads of that through these stories. Then there are two others. The psychosocial action dimension is very important because, as you saw from the student reactions, some emotional reactions can be a barrier to engaging with the climate problem. And then, of course, on the other side, other emotional and mental health issues that have to do with having to face climate impacts, extreme weather, losing your family, your home, all of that. So the psychological dimension is extremely important. However, I'm not going to have time to talk about it. I just want to point out that it is there. I will touch a little bit on the epistemological dimension because, as I pointed out, the ways we think about the world are really important. So moving on, and by the way, anyone who is interested in diving a little deeper, I have a paper that's out, a chapter in a book, and it's a very interesting volume with contributions from around the world, freely downloadable. So, but what I want to point out here is that you'll notice that the old-fashioned science literacy is not going to do it. So there's been some recent work in science literacy that is really important. Science Literacy Vision 3, or critical scientific literacy, which is not just about knowledge of science, and in fact, not even just about the societal context of science. It goes on to talk about socio-political action to challenge power hierarchies for two reasons. One is that we know from the history of science that science has been appropriated by power. that science is used as an instrument of, if you look at the history of colonialism and the role of science in colonialism, for someone like me who loves science, it was a shock to realize that science and colonialism are so tied together. But also, power hierarchies stand in the way of meaningful climate action. So science has to get out there beyond the ivory tower. And that is what I mean by the epistemological broadening of science literacy. So in the classroom, especially when you're teaching a course that is not a course on climate science exclusively, but let's say I'm teaching a physics course, I want to introduce climate change in it, or I'm teaching a literature course and I want to talk about climate change. The implication of what I've talked about is that scientists must learn how to teach about economics and history and justice. Okay, always ongoing project for me. And flip side, social scientists, humanities scholars must also teach climate science basics. Okay, but this begs the question, what do we mean by climate science basics? And I ask myself, what does everyone need to know for a good understanding of climate science? Where by good understanding, I mean that it's a holistic understanding and that it contains the essentials of climate science that helps us understand the impacts and the scenarios and the possibilities. And at the same time, a good understanding would be one that avoids piecemeal learning, because climate science topics are typically scattered over a semester of a class devoted to another subject. So what is it that everyone needs to know? And how can it be possible for a humanities scholar to teach climate science? And why should they? Well, firstly, if you want to have a holistic understanding, then you have to teach all the threads, even if you are amplifying your own discipline. And secondly, where else maybe the students won't get that knowledge anywhere else. So it's as I think it's my responsibility. So what I've discovered in my journey is that there are three large concepts that embrace the critical scientific information, and at the same time, they're interdisciplinary and even transdisciplinary. So they're accessible to everyone. And I'm not going to have time to talk about these in detail. So I'm just going to run through some slides very quickly. I ask your forgiveness for that. So the first large concept is the idea of steady state versus non-steady state, or if you want to use non-technical language, the idea of balance and imbalance. So again, we start local, we look at sea ice mass imbalance, and we connect that to the sea ice mass imbalance is, of course, a direct result of planetary scale imbalances in the carbon cycle and consequently in the Earth's energy budget. So you can actually, and these ideas are not difficult. If you have access to the right training and information, these are not difficult to understand and to teach. Then the other concept is the idea of critical thresholds. So consider for a moment that if I stand on the toes of one foot and I try to balance, I'm kind of swaying up and down, but I have some resilience to change, because if I tip this way, I can recover and then tip that way and so on. So I more or less maintain my balance. But any system that can be in a state of balance and can go into imbalance must cross a threshold, right? And so in other words, if you tug on my arm just a little bit, I'm going to start toppling over and I'm not going to be able to recover. And I'm going to go from a state of balance to a state of change until I reach a new state of balance on the floor, right? So crossing critical thresholds, whether they're abrupt or gradual, is something that these systems do. And these critical thresholds exist at the local level, for example, local ecosystems, but also at the global level. And this is where the planetary boundaries or Earth systems boundary concept is very useful pedagogically. According to this concept, there are 9, well, this is a work in progress. There are 9 planetary boundaries that define a safe operating space, so-called, for humanity. And we have transgressed 5 of these. Now, pedagogically, this concept is very useful. I'm not going to talk about each of these, but the most important to me pedagogically is that, firstly, it tells us that human beings can't do whatever they want to do on the planet. We are limited, we are indebted to natural cycles and processes. But also, it accentuates the fact that climate change is one of multiple social environmental problems. we are having, we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction of species. The nitrogen cycle is imbalanced, land use changes, plastic pollution. And not just that, all of these are interrelated. So if you tug at one thread, the whole web of relationships is influenced by that. So this actually begs the question, if we are having all these crises simultaneously, do they have a common cause? Is there some one thing, root cause, that's driving it? And that leads us to look at the polycrisis and look underneath the polycrisis. And I'll talk a little later about where that takes us. So the third thing that we can ask, the third large concept, is that, well, okay, if there are all these interrelationships in the system, can we predict when we cross a threshold, whether it's local or global? Do we know how to come back if we cross it and all of that? And those questions are all about relationships between different parts of the system. And this is where the idea of complex systems is so important. Of course, the roots of complex system science go back to the 1880s with Poincaré talking about solar systems. But much of the important work really got started in the 20th century. And so this is a new science in one sense. And to the point that there is no universally agreed definition of a complex system. But I use the Aristotelian dictum that such a system is one in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, the relationships matter so much that they can change the nature and function of the parts themselves. So one way to illustrate it is to describe a system that's not complex, like a clock. It's complicated, but it's not complex. It consists of gears and springs. When you understand what they do, you've understood the clock. A gear always behaves like a gear. A spring can never change into one, nor can a gear change into a spring. Whereas complex systems in the real world around us, we are surrounded by them. We are part of them. And these are some of the examples. So when we talk about complex systems and their key features, and I'm sorry, I'm going a little fast here because I don't want to take too much time. We point out things like the nonlinearity, the kinds of feedback loops, tipping elements, multiple kinds of causality. And so the kind of Newtonian predictability that you have when you throw a ball into the air and you know exactly where it is at every moment, that is lost in complex systems. That doesn't mean we can't know things about them. It's just that it's not the same system. So again, going from the local to the global, one of the questions students ask me is that, why are we talking about the Arctic? The Arctic is far away. Why don't we talk about the changes happening here? And that's when we get to talk about teleconnections. So the discussion on complex systems really helps facilitate that. So we know, for example, that these regional climatic entities and patterns actually are interrelated. They influence each other. So recent work that seems to indicate that Arctic sea ice melt affects, of course, ocean circulation, and that might be implicated in the drying out of the Amazon rainforest. So, and also there's some work that seems to indicate that a higher incidence of forest fires in the northwestern United States connected to Arctic sea ice melt and Greenland ice sheet loss. So these teleconnections become very important in illustrating the fact that there's no place on Earth that is climatically isolated. So this is I'm just going to show you quickly. These are the 5 natural subsystems of the planet as identified by Earth scientists. And this is a visual tool that I use to help students develop a holistic appreciation of climate change. I introduce it each time we do a climate science or climate change topic so that students develop a layered and deeper understanding of the problem. So we also introduce the anthroposphere, but we put it in quotes because we know from these stories that I've told you and other stories like them that not all humans are equally responsible for the climate crisis, and nor are all humans equally impacted. So we point out that there are marginalized groups in human societies that are most impacted, and so climate justice becomes front and center. So very quickly, this picture is just to show you a visual tool that contains all these large meta concepts. So moving on from there, I just want to mention briefly that unlike the way I've talked about this here, we integrate the idea of justice as we talk about the basic essential science of climate change. So these three big concepts that I've just talked about, how does justice come in? We talk about the interrelationships between human and natural systems. We talk about who's responsible for the violations of planetary boundaries and the conditions of imbalance. So, and through that, we can talk about climate justice. And we can, in fact, this is a picture, a sketch of inequality, economic inequality, drawn by artist Michelle Gottlob. And it shows how, it illustrates how, for the privilege of a small number of people, an entire socioeconomic, now globalized structure has been built that is resource hungry, destructive of the planet and of people. And we are all caught in it. And of course, climate justice comes in through ways that I've already mentioned. So, and I want to mention very quickly also that currently this is what's happening in central India right now, where the largest contiguous forest in central India, the Hasdeo forest, parts of it are being razed down for coal mining. And the people who are literally putting their lives on the line to protect the forest are the Adivasis, the indigenous people of the region. So we have a socio-economic system that results in disposable people and disposable nature. So, and I'm not going to talk more about this, this paper from 2020, just to say that the bottom line is we can't afford the rich. So again, an effective pedagogy of climate change with climate justice at its heart, the 4 dimensions. I'm going to talk in the last bit about the epistemological dimension. I'm going to tell you my last story, my 3rd story for this talk. And this story I owe, and I thank the people of the North Slope of Alaska, the Inupiaq people, for this traditional tale. It's very short. This is how it goes. Once upon a time, there was a little mouse who lived his whole life underground. One day, he decided to tunnel up to the tundra to see what the world was like. So he dug a tunnel up and up and up and up, and he emerged on top of the tundra. And he stretched his paws up and he touched the ceiling of the world. He stretched his paws sideways and he touched the sides of the world. And he said, "I am the biggest thing in the world." The punchline of this story is that the little mouse had emerged on the tundra on the inside of an overturned boot. So the ceiling of the world was the sole of the boot, and the sides of the world were the sides of the boot. So this is a teaching story. It's clearly about human hubris and human foolishness, not about mice at all. And it's also about how our preconceptions limit our understanding of the world. So the epistemological dimension is very important. So when we look at different events that happen, whether they're climatic or socio-political, until we understand what the trends are, we don't have a deep understanding. But then we need to go to the system structure to see how things are interrelated in order to have an even deeper understanding. However, our system structures are dictated by our mental models. What are the assumptions and beliefs that we take to create these systems through which we make sense of the world? And I'm going to very quickly, I'm going to use the term paradigm in its broadest sense, and I'm going to very quickly make a claim that seems a little preposterous, but I think that in a coarse-grained way, it does have some validity. That I'm going to make the claim that the dominant paradigm of modern industrial civilization is a mechanistic one. That it actually, a part of its origin is from the history of my own field, from Newtonian physics. And mechanistic means that for everything, the metaphor is a machine, and that we consider the relationships between the parts to be straightforward, simple, and fixed, so that you can understand the whole by understanding the parts, and therefore you can consider any system as in a separatist sort of way, as consisting of distinct units that are unchangeable. And that in principle then, you can control the system, because after all, what's a machine for? It's for a purpose, and you can tinker with it. You can manipulate it. And of course, it's an impersonal view of the universe. The clock is the metaphor for the Newtonian paradigm. So the trouble is that if it was limited to physics, the Newtonian paradigm wouldn't do so much harm. And in fact, physics is trying to move beyond it with things like quantum physics and relativity. However, its influence is well beyond physics. The mechanistic model of the human body, the idea of the assembly line, the social atomism as it manifests in some of the theories of mainstream economics, the education system with its watertight compartments of disciplines, the separation of human and nature, the dominance of humans. So here's one really important thing stories can do. So to illustrate that importance, by the way, this book is worth reading. Story Listening is the name of the book. Stories are ontological tools. That is, they help consolidate identities. They help build realities. So we talked a moment ago, I talked about power hierarchies. How is it that we accept these power hierarchies? Partly because in every society, there are implicit and explicit dominant narratives. In other words, stories that people tell or are told to them about the power structure. Consider, for example, the stories that are told in America about the rich. So when you take stories that come from and emerge from other communities, then they can actually help challenge these dominant narratives by showing multiple points of view, alternative ways of thinking and being in the world, and enhancing new understanding through causal sense-making. Now, what is very exciting to me is, and as somebody who has come only recently into my climate risk, is that there seems to me to be an epistemological broadening in climate science as well. So the power of narrative has been used by governments, by corporations, by advertisers. It's more than time that we start to think about the power of narrative for other purposes. For example, to benefit society, for science to help to actually become an ally of society instead of an ally of power. So for instance, scenarios are narratives, and also physical climate storylining, the work of Ted Shepard and associates, and also climate risk narratives, among a few others that I've so far come across in my readings. Now, these are very important. They have arisen in the attempt to make climate science meaningful to communities on the ground, but they're also important pedagogically. And I'm currently working on how to use these in the classroom. Let me tell you what I already do in the classroom with climate science as story. So I've been working, even before I taught climate change, with physics as a kind of story that nature is telling us, or at least that we get to eavesdrop on the stories that matter tells. So I have students enact physical processes, which may seem childish and absurd, but it's actually supported by education research and embodied learning. So that is, in fact, what it does when you enact physical climate processes, is that it brings the non-human on stage. It reminds us that it's not just about us, whether that non-human is another species or whether it's a climatic element. And I'm showing you these pictures. These are pictures. This is of a little experiment I did with village children in the Eastern Himalayas in 2019. Where after about 45 minutes of instruction with the help of some college students on the greenhouse effect, here they are enacting the greenhouse effect. And then, of course, we go on to relate all that to the changes that they're seeing in their young lives, the dramatic changes in the Himalayan climate. So paradigm shifts in science, paradigm shifts in education, really exciting stuff. So, and I just want to quickly, near the end, point out that it was a kind of amazing discovery to me, coming from the sciences, that these three large meta concepts that I had discovered on the way to answering the question, what is the essential science that everyone needs to know, actually are present in indigenous knowledge systems. So indigenous knowledge systems consider the world to be a priori complex. And they, for the most part, regulate what they take for the land. They set themselves to have limits. And the idea of balance is central through concepts like collaborative reciprocity that govern the relationships between the human and the non-human. So through story, we go into these different terrains. We go from people into the sciences, from the local to the global, and then back again. And I'm not going to talk about this, but just to show you that if you're interested in an alternative paradigm climate action plan, look at the Swinomish tribe of the Northwestern United States. Look at their climate adaptation plan. It's really, really interesting and really different. Okay, in summary, this is, I think, my second last slide. What do the best stories do? They're inherently transdisciplinary. They're boundary objects. In other words, they're portals and pathways between disciplines, between paradigms, between peoples, between the local and the global. They can show complex interconnections. They can foreground issues of justice and equity. They can transcend barriers and dichotomies. They make the abstract real. They connect local, global, personal, political, time and space. And as epistemological tools, they can challenge our unquestioned assumptions and dominant paradigms. And I haven't even had time to talk about speculative fiction. In fact, that's a whole other talk. But speculative fiction can be a great paradigm buster, and it can inculcate a future sense and anticipatory thinking in our people, in our students, in our communities. So I'm going to end with this slide, and I'm going to, with apologies to the Inupiat, add a speculative sequel to the story of the mouse on the tundra that ended up on the underside of the shoe, the overturned shoe. And this is what I want to imagine, that let's say as the mouse is stretching his paws to touch the sides of the world, or what he thinks is the world, he pushes a little bit too hard on one side and the shoe, the boot, turns over. And the mouse finds himself on the tundra with the sea ice stretching before him underneath a sky full of stars. And I want to end with this question. What would the mouse see? What new concepts, ideas, and possibilities might emerge? What new paradigms await us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh, first for that very illuminating presentation, and second for joining us from Massachusetts, USA, all the way from there. As a climate translator, we definitely see how your research and teaching is at the nexus of all these complex considerations of science, society, and justice, which are all interconnected in the question of the climate crisis. And the stories that you shared really show how these sharings also become invitations to learn about other disciplines outside of our own, including local and indigenous knowledge. At this point of the program, we will now be having our open forum. We will now be reading some of the questions that we've gathered from the chat. Some of these were sent anonymously. Our first question harkens back to an early slide of yours. It seemed that a lot of early student reactions that you encountered were despairing and pessimistic. There seems to be a dichotomy in the climate space about whether it's being hopeful or being outraged, which will spark change. But it seems that some of your students responded to despair with paralysis. What can you say about the need for hope, and what is the role of climate education and stories?
That's a wonderful and very deep question. I'm going to try to do justice to it in only a little time. I think, we need the kind of hope that is more like the optimism of the will, because we cannot deny that things are already difficult for large numbers of people in many countries. And so we cannot afford unrealistic hope, that, oh, everything's going to be fine. Someone else is going to fix the problem. The kind of hope we need is a kind of determined hope that admits and embraces the realities on the ground, and then works through them to think about alternatives, to work with people on towards the world that we want, the world that we still can save. The other way that I sometimes feel, that hope and despair are in a way two sides of the same coin. So imagine that if you were out somewhere with your family or with people you loved, and someone starts to attack you. Okay, are you going to think, oh, is there hope for my family or not? Should I just give up because there's no hope? What would you do? You would fight like hell, right? And so in a way, hope and despair are both traps. So I guess my answer is we need the kind of hope that can survive despair and that exists by acknowledging despair and working through it. But we also, in a way, need to not depend on hope, because then we'll only work when we're hopeful and not if we're not. So where its role is in climate education is that when people feel a sense of agency, that they can do something. And in my classes, what I try to do, and by the way, it's become very difficult since COVID, but particularly before COVID, we used to do some pretty ambitious things with regard to projects. So I'll give you one small example. One class created a heat impact awareness tool for senior citizens after consultation with multiple experts and interviewing seniors and realizing that heat waves in Massachusetts are going to impact them the worst. And then they gave it to the city of Framingham. So, doing something that's meaningful and engages you with the community is like a wonderful, wonderful feeling. Then you don't feel despair. You're working on the problem. So yeah, that can be very helpful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. I like how you framed both hope and despair as mirror images of the human response, and that action actually fuels our hope. So our next question reads, I agree, instructors need to broaden perspectives to present a holistic picture of complex polycrises. How can we build capacities of educators in this way? The path of academics through master's degree to PhD degrees is usually more towards specialization, and there is sometimes less incentive for inter- and transdisciplinary work, which is longer or harder to publish work in the nexus of disciplines. Time spent building relationships with other sectors are not weighed as much in performance evaluations. How can we recognize our own, how can we encourage our own educational institutions to recognize complex systems? Any insights are appreciated.
Thank you, Dr. Kendra, for that wonderful question. I wish I had a good answer to it. This is something that I also am struggling with. Because changing paradigms is extremely difficult, as we know from the shift from geocentrism to heliocentrism was non-trivial, but it's very, very important work. I think that the formality of educational institutions and the fact that they're entrenched in certain structures becomes a barrier to needed change, and also the separation from society and societal concerns. So I think that pushing and, I think that the biggest paradigm shifts are needed among educational administrators, to enable such things as faculty development, to enable, transdisciplinary work, and to reward transdisciplinary work. If you read the 2020 Brookings report from Christina Kwok, among the things she talks about in terms of barriers to meaningful climate education is this institutional kind of digging your feet in the sand, and the fact that we don't have good measures of effectiveness. We measure that, okay, yes, this school is doing this checklist, mark it off. But what the impacts are, what the real change is, whether there's actually real change, is not, we don't have good measures of that, and that's part of the problem. So I think that if we can persuade administrators and heads of department and so on, and if we can open up the institution, like blow the walls down and invite the community and go out into the community and do work in the community. Maybe every course should have some kind of, in fact, I know an institution right here, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, that has introduced community-based learning as a mandatory part of getting a degree. So so that can be done. It's a hard struggle, but it's so worth it. So we need to do that. And also, I would say that we need to also look at our own, we have inherited systems from European colonialism. These are not the only ways to do things. We really need to look at the different diverse ways of doing things, of thinking about these things and working through these things in different countries and cultures, and inculcate that into the education system. So that's my inadequate answer to that very complex question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Singh. It seems that Dr. Kendra was very satisfied and very pleased with your very insightful answer. It's good that you mentioned that, because we do have a question which is connected to your answer. So you mentioned that education seems to be isolated from society. So this next question reads, I was very surprised to see your slide mentioning that climate education is not even mentioned as a climate strategy in some NDCs. Why do you think governments are not viewing education as a powerful tool? And how and should the education sector retool itself so that it can have a more prominent place in climate strategy?
Well, I think that governments often, many of our governments have been hijacked by vested interests. Let's admit that. Perhaps governments are not as interested in solving the climate problem as their leaders might be interested in getting re-elected, for example. So again, we have to recognize the complicity of power structures and power hierarchies and vested interests. But again, so in other words, this, I'll give you an example. The story of Parvati and the village women, okay? This is a community that nobody cares about. Okay, these are communities that there's no governmental infrastructure to take care of these people. So they have to take care of themselves. Okay, and so in a way that is asking us the question that what is the role then of climate scientists with a social conscience, or policymakers, or whoever, or citizens with a social conscience? We can't always work through governments. But we can push governments, and governments are important because they can set the large scale changes that we want. They'll only do that if they're pushed. How we can push them? Well, I can give you one small example that in India, the current government which is very, very pro-corporate, was actually intending to take out key climate change topics from the middle school curriculum and the high school curriculum. And I'm part of a loose coalition of educators, and many educators pushed back, wrote a letter, and so on and so forth, which was published in multiple languages, multiple places. The government had to back down. So we can't rely on governments. We have to be vigilant and push governments and other entities. But we always also have to remember that it's not through governments alone that we are going to do this. What the alternative is like, we need to investigate that. But clearly, we have a problem that is beyond national boundaries. So nations and governments have have their limits. So we need to recognize that. Great question.
Yes. Thank you for your answer, Dr. Singh. We have another question, this time from Madhusri Mukherjee. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Please, can we clarify if the story of the scientists and the elder on the ice is real or fictional?
Oh, it's a real story, but I have dramatized it a little bit, that's all. So that's why, and I present it as that this is based on real life accounts. So, I put in some of the dialogue and so on, but this is based on a story that a geophysicist actually told me, as well as other interviews. So yes.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Our next question is from Angela Cristina Cabrera. How do you respectfully approach indigenous groups in presenting their cultural practices in climate education, granted that you are not a member of those groups?
This is very, very important because indigenous people have had, the oppressive systems have not succeeded, but the attempt to take away their voices and their agency has been often centuries long. So how do you approach them, and how do you kind of present their cultural practices without making it cultural appropriation? This is something that I thought about a lot. And I have talked to people from indigenous communities in India and in the US. I've talked to scholars, and I've asked them, is it all right if I talk about these things? And I have always got responses like, firstly, you have to educate yourself. You have to make sure, you have to go with humility, because there are things that we don't know. And there are ways that you can give offense without intending it. So you really have to do your homework. That's the first thing. And secondly, you have to talk to people in the community and ask, like, am I doing this the right way? Does this make sense? And inevitably, they have said that this is important to do, because there is a narrow place between appropriation and erasure. And that's the place I try to walk in.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. That's a very relevant insight for researchers who are seeking to be involved in, creating these action researches with indigenous groups. Pivoting back to the classroom a bit for our next question from Sofia Dairit. Thank you for the wonderful and insightful talk. I suppose teaching in a classroom, educators have the privilege of interacting with minds that are open to the knowledge imparted to them. Do you have experience and insights on communicating climate change education on those who are resistant to the topic, such as skeptics or those who have been influenced by misinformation?
Well, I have a few tentative thoughts on that. In the classroom, by the way, there have been students who have been resistant to accepting the reality of climate change. And what I do, it's all in the relationship you build. And one of the things I have not talked about is how important it is to have a non-hierarchical, non-lecture based classroom. Okay, so if you read that chapter that I referenced, then I explain a little bit about the importance of creating a classroom community where students feel comfortable, in particular feeling comfortable being wrong, because that's how we learn, but also where they know that I accept and respect them completely, no matter if they disagree with me, even on climate change, which is something I feel strongly about. So every once in a while, rarely, I've had students who just refuse to accept the reality of it. And I tell them that, look, it's your journey. You have to take it. I'm not going to impose on you. I care about you just as much as I always did. But I tell them that, and so, I tell them that make sure you know how to answer the questions, but in terms of personal belief, that's your journey. And almost without exception, by the end of the course, they have opened their minds a little bit. Okay, so that's happened. And again, I feel like from the little I've read on skeptics and the influence of misinformation, that's such a serious problem. We see that polarization everywhere, and social media just exacerbates it. I think that for them, it's much more difficult. And again, it's in the relationship. If you can build a real, authentic relationship with the person, you have a better chance of seeing whether they can see what you see about the climate problem. So yeah, but on the mass scale, honestly, I don't know. I think that there is research on this, but it's not sufficient. And definitely not enough research in the global south, as I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I guess it really matters that we establish a respectful relationship with people that we might even disagree with on fundamental issues. We have room for just one last question. So this question is institutionalizing a course or subject on climate change a useful approach to pedagogy, or does it become a hurdle because students view it as just one of many?
Another good question. I'm really impressed with the questions. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, it can become like, oh, this is just another course. But there, the teacher, the educator has the responsibility of making that course relevant to everyday life. And it's even harder with pure physics courses than it is when you're integrating climate science. And in fact, when you integrate climate change into a physics course, it actually becomes relevant. So, like today, my students were talking about the abnormally hot weather we are having for November, 21, 22 degrees Celsius. And I didn't prompt them, but they connected it to what we are studying. So, so I think one has to make a deliberate attempt to relate what you're learning, no matter what the topic, to the world around us. And there are ways to do that. I've been working on that for some time. It can be done. And part of it also is to take the learning outside the classroom. So for example, in the past, my classes have given delivered guest presentations on climate change to other classrooms in the university. Or they even once went to a museum of science in Boston and critiqued a climate change exhibit. And the museum actually responded very positively to that. So when you take the learning outside the classroom, when you kind of melt the walls away, then it really makes a difference. Then students realize that this actually is something that means something in the real world. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh, for those insightful answers. And thank you very much as well to our participants for your questions and for this very engaging open forum that unfortunately we have to end at this point. So now we move on to the awarding of the certificate. We present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Vandana Singh for sharing her time and insights in the webinar entitled Storying Climate, Transdisciplinary Adventures in the Classroom and Beyond on the 8th of November, 2022. Signed by Ms. Jean Hardalesa Mijares, the Program Manager for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and by Dr. Charlotte Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez, the Director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and focal point of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Singh, for sharing your time and insights with us.
Thank you so much. This is a great honor. I really, really appreciate it.
And now to give the closing remarks, may we have the next slide again? May we call on Dr. Theodore G. Shepard, Grantham Professor of Climate Science, Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading, United Kingdom, and co-chair of the Science Plan Development Team of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program.
Good evening, or good day to you. You can hear me okay, can you? So thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I actually wanted to start with the beginning of the webinar series, the Climate Voices on the Ground. I've gone back and played the recordings, and they're really fascinating. And I wanted to link that to today's talk. We heard first from Emma Porio on community solidarity, exemplified by the northernmost municipality in the Philippines, where the weather is stormy and dangerous, and vigilance is key, and adaptive resilience has long been a way of life. And she emphasized that resilience is about a community of solidarity, about caring for each other. Then we had La Homero and colleagues on the coastal communities and typhoon risk there. But the interesting thing there was that the locals do not want to relocate, even though they're being essentially advised to. That challenges the whole concept of limits to adaptation, because it's their climate risk, it isn't ours. And then Maria and Raquel on the micro enterprises, which lie at the bottom of the economic pyramid but permeate society, and their vulnerability, as with the ITBAYAT, is led to this innate agility. I guess your word in Filipino is descarte. And to the development of social capital as a coping capacity. And I think all those studies really illustrated the principles of small is beautiful, that our greatest asset for resilience is our social capital. But it's so often forgotten by accountants and economists. I don't know if you've had the experience. I've had experience of cost-saving exercises within organizations which squander the social capital and actually lose efficiency. My Climate Risk is all about building our social capital and empowering local communities with the ability to use their own knowledge and share knowledge, because knowledge is power. And as we've heard, the challenge for local knowledge is to respect the local detail, but to cast it in a general framework which provides an epistemic authority. And that's what climate storylines are all about. People ask me to turn storylines into a software package, but to me, that's to miss the point. And Emma emphasized the need for contextualized solutions rather than replication. Lau emphasized the power of stories and emotions, as we've heard from Vandana as well, and Maria and Raquel explained how narratives can capture the essence of systems thinking, but in a non-technical way. And I think all these examples illustrate how climate information can be made meaningful at the local scale. Vandana now has shown us how traditional science education applied to climate change can evoke the wrong kinds of emotions and be counterproductive, and how stories can provide an alternative to make sense of climate change and offer hope, which is so important because young people are traumatized by climate change. And the key is to place the climate change within the local context, with their history of social and power relationships and the value of traditional knowledge, where climate change is just one of many challenges that are facing a vulnerable people. I think it's a conceit of climate scientists that climate change is the only problem. So this connects very much back to the first part of the webinar series, but it really opens Pandora's box, because ultimately these challenges all result from man's inhumanity to man. So it's an ethical issue in the end. It's not a scientific issue, it's an ethical issue. And Vandana teaches climate change through these three meta concepts of balance, imbalance, critical thresholds, and complex interconnections. This goes back to the limits to growth and systems thinking, which sets it all in a very rigorous foundation, but it places climate justice front and center. There's just no way around that. What she proposes is incredibly radical from a pedagogical perspective. I have a physics training too, so I know exactly what she's talking about. And by providing narratives, she exposes and challenges the existing but implicit narratives, such as reductionism and linear thinking, and also argues for taking higher education into the community. So it's all extremely radical, and we're delighted to have Vandana in our My Climate Risk team, and hopefully we can all help take up her challenge to us to radicalize our pedagogy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shepherd. Indeed, we do circle back to small is beautiful, and it's always worth reflecting and relearning the importance of the bottom-up approaches that we advocate for. At this point, may we request everyone to please turn on your videos momentarily for our group photo. We'll give everyone a few moments to turn your videos on. So nice to see the faces of our participants, and I also see some familiar faces and names from our previous webinar, so welcome back. Right, so I'll be taking the first screenshot in 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Now, please allow me to take the second page of the screenshots. Okay. Taking the second page in 3, 2, 1. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you as well, Dr. Vandana. She has just linked the chapter that she referenced earlier, which she authored in the chat box. So if you are interested, please do check that link out. To our dear participants, we would greatly appreciate your feedback, of course. So please answer the event evaluation form with the QR code and link flashed on the screen. Requests for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form. Thank you once again to Dr. Singh for sharing your insights and your time. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the sign language interpreters with us today, Ms. Edna Comia and Ms. Annalisa Regis Tolentino. And to all of you, thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. We hope that you have gained fresh insights on climate education, the use of stories and storylines, and the interconnections of our nuanced experiences of climate change. Please don't forget to accomplish our event evaluation form. Our tech team has posted the link in the chat. And again, requests for e-certificates will be coursed through the form. Now, later this week, we will be following this inaugural session with a second webinar for the series titled Sustainable Production and Stakeholder Management with Mr. Raymond Rodolfo of the Department of Environmental Science, Ateneo de Manila University. You may register in the link or in the QR code shown on screen. And that is it for this session. I've said this many times, but thank you. Thank you once again, and please enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. This was so wonderful. You all give me hope. Take care and bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. I really enjoyed that talk.
I
And it's
love the
nice.
questions and the company. Take care.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vandana.
Have a good evening.